what's up guys, welcome back to another video. This is a reaction to the 7 distinct US ideologies and why they matter. And this is a video that was posted literally about 12 hours ago from when I'm doing this reaction. I mean, I think this video is going to go up in like 5 days time from when I'm doing this reaction. Nah, like 4 days time, so close to that. But we're going to see what this video explains, and I guess for me, learning about the ideologies, I guess how they compare to Europe and to the UK, and I guess how a lot of them probably are very similar or were also passed to Europe over time, because I know the US in terms of the Western world sort of, I guess, I don't want to say leads it, but like in terms of ideologies and stuff, when the US was first formed, I feel like it was like it was a change in like the political landscape, and yeah, I just guess Europe sort of followed from the US at that point, or vice versa. Maybe it's just a mesh of both together. But yeah, this says 7 distinct US ideologies. I don't know what ideologies this will go into, so we're going to check this out and yeah, learn about what this video shows me.
American ideology originated from a core idea: distinctiveness from the overseas motherland. From this initial idea came 2 schools of thought. The first, which held close to the overseas British system, but simply wanted to establish a separate and independent, albeit identical, system governed by the Americans for the Americans. In the words of John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, if not for its present corruption, the British model would be the most perfect in all the world. And Hamilton's response that even with its present corruption, it is the most perfect system yet to exist. The second school of thought which emerged from this idea challenged the perfection of the British system. Rather, it argued the institutions of monarchy, of aristocracy, even of class as they presently existed, were faulty and demanded not merely separation from the motherland, but reform. Drawing more heavily upon the liberal ideas of the Enlightenment, we would see this second school of thought grow into early American republicanism, or anti-federalism as it would come to be known a little down the line. Over time, these 2 ideologies would be developed and fleshed out by their chief architects, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson respectively. Though it should be remembered that early American republicanism was far more amorphous and influenced by many men of the time, including Patrick Henry and John Adams' own brother Samuel Adams, not just Jefferson. As the colonies finally broke away from Britain, the new country entered into a transitional period. Not the United States as we know it today, but rather a confederation of states, a far looser union which essentially allowed each state to function as its own country, or something very close to it. The flaws of this early model became apparent very quickly. It was from the proposed solution to this problem that the Hamiltonian system earned its name, Federalism, an effort to move away from the Confederation system to instead pursue a closer union, a federation under a new constitution. Jefferson and other early Republicans would challenge this change as anti-federalists, though Jefferson did recognize the need to improve the Confederation model. A compromise was ultimately achieved which passed the new Constitution, but with an adjoined Bill of Rights. The United States was finally born, and Washington assumed the role of president, while the government came under the control of individuals largely aligned with Hamilton and the Federalist ideology. Federalism would come to stand for a handful of core principles: centralization of government, economics, and military under a powerful executive, supremacy of the federal government over the governments of the states, economic nationalism for the purpose of strengthening domestic production and industry. More deeply than that, federalism sought to build a highly meritocratic and moralistic society, and create an essential aristocracy of virtue that all citizens would aspire to join. Naturally, some saw such views as only palatable to those already in positions of power. Jefferson and his brand of American republicanism, what would eventually be known as democratic republicanism or simply Jeffersonianism on the other hand, developed a far more populist character, especially in the rural parts of the country, and most especially in the South. Jeffersonianism sought to appeal to the common farmer and advocated positions of agrarianism, of state supremacy over the federal government, of limiting the abilities of the federal government and the executive. In foreign policy, it was a bit more anti-British than the Federalist faction, and while the name of Hamilton's game was consolidation, Jefferson's was expansion, to open up.
What I'm noticing is like they're sort of closer here, and they're slowly splitting further and further apart. I guess maybe that's just how it's showing it here, or maybe it is to show the ideologies like the complete opposite ends of the spectrum.
More land for more farmers to become landowners and active stakeholders in the country. Jeffersonianism was far more egalitarian than Hamiltonianism, though naturally there were some caveats. After their long reign over the executive and legislative branches, some began to feel that the Jeffersonians had themselves become too elitist an establishment. Further resentment over the handling of the War of 1812 and the short-sightedness of both demilitarizing the country and instigating hostility with Britain led many to believe that while Jeffersonianism was inherently valid, a stronger executive was needed to provide for the security of the country in times of emergency.
Okay.
Thus emerged the Democratic Party and the ideology of American democracy, or Jacksonianism. led by General Andrew Jackson, a more radically democratic and decentralizing faction, albeit now with a tendency toward favoring the power of the executive over Congress. The Democrats sought to further open up political participation to more of the American public, to do away with unelected offices, further the supremacy of states' rights, and annex additional territories, just as Jefferson would have wanted. To challenge what was seen as the bordering on tyrannical mob rule of the Democrats, remnants of the Democratic Republican and dwindling Federalist parties coalesced into the Whig Party, named so for the anti-monarchical party of Brit. In contrast to the Democrats, the Whigs upheld the supremacy of the legislative branch in political matters and aimed to reduce the authority of the executive to prevent him from becoming a tyrannical monarch, just as Jefferson would have wanted. Of course, both of these new factions saw themselves as the true successors to Jeffersonianism, Jackson believing he was purifying the party of its corruption for the good of the people, and the Whigs believing that they were preserving the party and its rule of law for the good of the people. The Whigs, many of whom had recognized the shortcomings of Jeffersonianism during the 1812 war, would build upon their platform by advocating for major infrastructure investment, protectionist tariffs to favor the success of domestic industries over foreign ones, and a modernization of the country. Minor factions also began to emerge from the early to mid-1800s. Jackson's rise gave rise to those even more radical than Jackson, nullifiers who further challenged the authority of federal power and who later would become contributors to Southern secession. As immigration to the United States increased at a time when a national identity was beginning to emerge in the North, a nativist faction arose in the form of the Know-Nothing Party with a particular aversion to Catholicism as a foreign influence. There also existed the Anti-Masonic Party, which took aim at Masons, the wealthy, and Jackson himself as something of an anti-elitist party. The Anti-Masons would go on to contribute to the Whig movement, while the Nullifiers and Know-Nothings would amalgamate with the Democrats and Whigs respectively later down the line to create new factions. The Whigs would ultimately collapse as a party, with their members, along with the members of the Know-Nothing Party and a large swath of staunch abolitionists, coalescing into a newly formed Republican Party. It had been felt by many Northerners by that point that the Democratic Party, despite having representation across the country, with all its advocacy of agrarianism, states' rights, and seeming protection of slavery, it was in fact nothing more than a party of the South, and so many felt it was only appropriate that a party of the North be established. The Republican Party and its ideology combined values of strong centralized government with egalitarianism, protectionism, modernization, and more. The Democrats in turn schismed along northern and southern lines, with the Nullifiers having fully evolved and hybridized with the Democrats to form a southern nationalist movement, one which saw the country as increasingly moving away from southern influence and instead pursuing policy.
Wait. Oh yeah, I think I remember seeing this. The Democrats and the Republicans. Wait, so I'm so confused. So this came from the Democrats? I forgot the party name or the group name, what is it?
Along northern and southern lines, with the Nullifiers having fully evolved and hybridized with the Democrats to form a southern nationalist movement, one which saw the country as increasingly moving away from southern influence and instead pursuing policy which was harmful to the southern way of life, namely the containment and abolition of slavery, the pursuit of industrialization and protectionism, and ultimately the collapse of southern agrarianism. Thus, the southern nationalists, southern Democrats sought secession. These strains of the Democratic and Republican ideologies would ultimately find themselves locked in a civil war, from which the Republican ideology emerged victorious, coming to dominate the majority of the country, while the influence of the Democratic Party remained largely confined to the South. Party ideology, however, would continue to evolve as the years wore on. Within the Democratic Party, for instance, there was an essential fragmentation between staunch Southern nationalists, or Redeemers as they became known, maintaining dominance in the post-Reconstruction South, but being confined to that region, holding themselves as the torchbearers of historic American or even just Southern values. Beyond the confines of the South, the Democratic ideology had created an offshoot in the form of the agrarian populists, located both within and outside of the South, largely within rural areas and particularly within the Great Plains and rural Midwest. Keeping with the pro-agrarian and pro-commoner positions advocated by Jefferson and Jackson, with sprinkles of the anti-elitism and perhaps even conspiratorial tendencies of the old anti-Masons, some even believing that the Republicans were seeking to create a dictatorship, suppress Christianity, or were controlled by foreign governments. And of course there were the Bourbon Democrats, another offshoot of Democratic ideology largely concentrated in the North and who by and large abandoned the more Southern and agrarian elements of the Democratic Party to instead concentrate on the small government and free market economics aspect of American democracy. The Republican Party, in contrast, had less of a fragmentation and more of a perpetual evolution, weeding out rival factions. During the Civil War, you had seen a rivalry between moderate and radical Republican factions, with the radicals initially emerging victorious under Ulysses S. Grant, Radical republicanism and later grantism was characterized by its support for patronage, backdoor dealing, extensive use of government and military power, and distinctly anti-Southern positions, itself developing a strong following in what became known as the stalwart faction of the Republican Party. Seeking to combat the corruption of the stalwarts, the more moderate faction would emerge on a platform of cracking down on corruption, enacting civil service reform, and promoting protectionism, meritocracy, and national modernization. Assimilating aspects of the agrarian populist movement, the National Republicans, faced with a rapidly advancing culture and economy, not to mention an increased sense of social morality, would evolve into the Progressives. The Progressives built upon the National Republican model by furthering meritocracy and reform into the realms of business and personal morality. The United States was no longer a backwater that was doing fine for a state in the Americas. No, it was a first-class power among the great powers of the world. With so much wealth and capability, many now advocated for the alleviating of social ills and for the raising of the American national character and standard of living to new heights. Parallel to the emergence of national republicanism and progressivism, many of the sentiments in favor of alleviating social ills combined with aspects of agrarian and industrial populism led to the emergence of the American labor and later socialist movement, the latter becoming manifest through inspiration from European-style socialism, and from which would later emerge a domestic strain of American communism. American anarchism would be further influenced by American socialism, though the American anarchist movement maintained older and scattered independent roots which only coalesced following the emergence of American socialism. Returning to the faction of progressivism, a minor split began to emerge on the matter of executive power. The progressives generally allowed for a greater use of federal power, but debate emerged on if the president could use executive power sweepingly for the common good. Theodore Roosevelt believed the executive should be able to, while William Howard Taft disagreed, creating a minor conservative and radical schism in the progressive movement. The end of the Great War would see America grow tired of progressive policy and seek a return to normalcy, something which was promised by the classically liberal and fiscally conservative Harding administration, which took to slashing many progressive-era policies and reducing the role of the government in the economy in a laissez-faire fashion. The fiscal conservatives would remain a major side faction of American politics before coalescing with socially liberal and internationalist elements to create the more fiscally center-right liberal Republicans or Rockefeller Republicans several years later. Simultaneously, the two wings of the progressive movement had themselves been in a process of evolving in the lead-up to the Great Depression. On the conservative side was the emergence of what might be called a light form of American corporatism, pioneered by Herbert Hoover, who envisioned a power balance in the country between business, labor, and government. On the radical side was New Dealism, which aimed to widely expand the use of government power to provide for the common good, strengthen the position of the executive, modernize national infrastructure, stimulate the economy through Keynesian deficit spending, and increase American interventionism in the name of combating tyranny and protecting democracy. Hand in hand with New Dealism came socially liberal values which would eventually branch off as their own distinct ideological faction opposed to New Deal-style big government politics, but still supporting social welfare and reform. Hoover's failure to address the Depression had seen Hooverism fracture while New Dealism surpassed it, borrowing aspects of Hooverist progressivism as well. Only remnants of Hoover-style progressivism remained, the majority of progressives being assimilated into the New Deal movement. Progressive remnants would thus establish an anti-New Deal coalition with the liberal Republicans and a number of Southern Democrats or Dixiecrats who were the modern successors to the early Southern nationalist ideology, continuing to advocate for regional Southern policy. This conservative coalition, as it was known, was a hodgepodge of policy positions, albeit with some key standouts, namely opposition to further government expansion, pro-business policy, protectionism, and isolationism from foreign affairs. While the coalition failed to gain any significant executive power, it managed to rein in some New Deal policies, but ultimately it fizzled out during the early years of the Cold War, as isolationism had been losing its momentum since the attack on Pearl Harbor and the rise of the perceived threat of Soviet conquest. The New Deal coalition would hold strong until the Johnson administration when it finally fractured. With the national politics...
So it's just breaking off more and more, which I guess it's just showing how, for me, why there is such a divide all the time with so many things politically, because there's so many different factions, so many different groups, ideologies, that may have opinions that they agree with a certain other group or whatever. But then they have other opinions that they don't agree, and they have their own opinions that they don't agree with anyone, or they'll agree with other ideologies that are the opposite. It's a very interesting topic. I've never really looked into ideologies in general. Like the UK, I don't know how this would sort of be judged either. But I've definitely learned a lot of things. I mean, the two major parties in the US alone, I wasn't realising the history of both and how they sort of not swapped, but like from what he's saying here, is he saying that the Democratic Party initially were more right wing or not? I think that's sort of what he's getting at, and the other way around was more left leaning, or maybe at that point in time they're both just so much more in the middle, a lot more similar than they are now, and that's how it sort of led to see it. But maybe it was just they were a lot more similar, and just had differing opinions here and there, but overall they were quite similar. Maybe not. I feel like with this they were always quite different, but it's definitely something. I mean, like, I'm not someone who's a lot of this stuff. I don't know about it at all, so I can't really talk on it. But it's still interesting to just see this stuff.
Split along Dixiecrats, economic liberals, social liberals, and labor progressives, a reorientation began to emerge which saw most of these factions unified under the banner of what would eventually become neoconservatism. Neoconservatism had promised the Dixiecrats the small government and states' rights they had desired, while promising the economic liberals deregulation and pro-business free market.
So they're sort of linking up again here for this part of ideology.
In addition to maintaining a strong support for foreign interventionism in the name of keeping the Soviet Union in check. Many, however, remained dissatisfied with early neoconservative politics and would schism away to become libertarians, placing a strong focus on small government, non-interventionism, and free market economics. Similarly, the remnant Dixiecrats not assimilated into the neoconservative movement would later amalgamate with socially conservative elements of the labor movement to become what are known as paleoconservatives, emphasizing strong borders, protectionism, isolationism, and social conservative values. Neoconservatism would see yet another transformation in the early 90s, amalgamating with the faction of social liberals to create neoliberalism, a movement which emphasized personal freedom, globalization, and pro-business policy alongside a welfare system, all while maintaining the interventionist positions of the neoconservatives for the sake of promoting democracy abroad. The neoliberals and neoconservatives have remained the dominant strand of American ideology across both parties up until relatively recently. America's role as a global superpower while domestic troubles stack higher has led to a resurgence of paleoconservative support and a potential fracturing of neoconservatism as well. Neoliberalism, on the other hand, appears to be in the process of evolution, borrowing more heavily from New Deal-era policy to create a form of neoprogressivism which aims to rival the promises of paleoconservatism or its evolutionary successor, while maintaining some of the globalist policies of neoliberalism to preserve American global influence. And that's all we have for now.
Right.
But who knows?
I mean, it's a lot to take in for me. Most American ideologies are the rural, early English settler lifestyle applied universally. Samuel Adams was John Adams' cousin, not his brother. Oh. What if the 23rd president of the United States was a man called Funny Valentine? What if H.P. Lovecraft became the president of the USA? Okay, what the fuck is going on in the comments? Well, there we go. I mean, look, I'm not aware on a lot of this. You can probably tell. I was pretty silent for a lot of it because I'm trying to take it all in. But I guess let me know your thoughts on this, and I guess maybe if there's some wrong things that were said, or just maybe from your opinion how you would say it was a bit different to what he said. But yeah, that's pretty much it. And yeah, I guess I'm just going to have to learn more from the comments in this one because there's a lot more for me to take in. I'm going to actually do a bit of looking up after this video to really try and understand it because I feel like I'm getting the grasp of it, but I'm just kind of surprised. Like, it seemed like the communism, like the part he mentioned about the party that was sort of like not for communism, but I guess something to do with that. He mentioned communism, and that came from the Republican side, which confused me. And then the Confederate flag that came from the Democrats or the Confederate Party or something, and that just I was very confused by that. But maybe I was just not listening properly or whatever. So yeah, I'm going to look into it more after this video. But let me know your thoughts on this, and until next time, like, subscribe, peace.